Okay, so we have our network manager and our UI in the scene. UI in this particular case isn't needed for a chat box. We don't have to have that, but obviously you won't be able to join a game without some form of a UI. So I have that in there. So let's go ahead and go up to the Add menu, Chat, Text box. But before we do that, let's have a look at the network manager. So if we come to the room settings, we'll leave that up, and now let's add this, and you'll see what happens in there. So you'll see it added a couple of events automatically. So when we join a room, the very first thing it does is it connects to the chat. Now, one thing you got to understand between the network manager and the chat box is they're actually two separate things. So connecting to chat is not the same thing as connecting to the Photon multiplayer server per se. Those are two separate connections, and so the chat box has to be able to connect. I made it tightly coupled pretty much between the network manager and the chat box. So when you connect to a room here, you're going to connect to the chat box. And the same thing with a lobby. We could say if you join a lobby, immediately connect to the chat box, depending on how you set up your game. But I say when you join a room, go ahead and connect to the chat box. So let's go ahead and look at some of the chat box settings. And let's actually select and open the preview app. So here in the chat box is just a simple UI that I've designed for you, and everything is under this panel object. So you can quickly enable or disable it if you want. There's a lot of settings here, so I've made it so you have to kind of click and open, otherwise this whole thing floods you with information. So starting up with the sound options. So the sound has an audio source on this, and the audio source, I made it so it's not 3D, and it has a simple chat notification when you get a new chat. Sound options are completely optional. Animation has built-in animation, and again, animation is optional for you. But the chat box parts, now these are important. These are the individual parts of the chat box. So this input field is where we type our message. The connection status, that's going to be potentially populated based on whether or not we are connected to the chat. And again, this is not connected to the same thing that Network Manager connects to. This is separate. And then the message objects. Now this is just a simple array that message objects will be placed into. And those message objects are under the dynamically generated objects. So the other message and your message. So the your message and the other message, they could be the same. They could be pretty much the exact same thing if you wanted. But I think it's a little bit nice if we open this up and see your name is over here, whereas the other message, the other person's name is over there. So it's a way to separate out if it's your message or if it's the other person's message. It's just a nice visual touch. And then the chat icon, that's this thing right here, and that will slowly pulse when you have a new chat, and that's only going to appear when something new is generated in here that's not from you. But you can also change that here. You can say only show chat when the window is closed, but you can also I thought you had something in here. I guess not, but this will display when a new chat icon appears. And again, these dynamic generated objects, if you look at these are really, really simple. It's just a simple player name and a player message, and it has a chat message component that highlights these. So what it does is this chat box, when it receives a new message, has internal logic to generate that, but also pass information to the chat box script. What I mean by that, it's that's the room button, sorry, your chat message. This chat message, it's going to pass information to the chat message. The player name is going to get populated with the player name, and the message is going to get populated with the message. So let's go ahead and open that back up. And this protocol setting, this is how you're going to be able to connect to the chat session. You can either connect to it via TCP, UDP, WebSockets, secure layers, however you want to set that up, and then the region that you want to connect to and then you can maybe do some other logic to dynamically set those regions. Now, one thing you got to be careful of is this is kind of a one-time deal. If I select something else here and then I go back and select none, there's some errors with this, in that if I select this port here and then go back to none, I will never be able to select none again. So just make sure that you select your authentication type correct once, and this is fully capable connecting over to Steam, Oculus, Facebook, PlayStation, Xbox, all these options here for you. And you can read a little bit more about that in the Photon documentation. And now this is very important. These are the input settings for your chat box, and that if I want to open up my chat window, I got to click the T button, and I can add more options here. I can create another chat button, but you need to make sure that inside your project settings, that those inputs are actually set up here. And if you run the test script, it's going to recognize that if you see here, there's no T, there's no escape button, there's no, and actually the escape button, actually it's right here. So the escape button's there, but the keypad enter, the return, the T, those aren't there, so you'll need to set those up. And you can change these, if I select these, there's a lot of options here of what you can select. And this is the name that we need to set up. So if I come here to project settings and duplicate this, it actually needs to be called T, because it's called T here. But if I do this one, see it's called keypad enter. We never use spaces, just remember that. So it's keypad enter. And that's the name. It's going to find it on the name. And that button can be whatever you want it to be. But the positive button, I wanted to say enter. So now we've got that set up. So that's pretty easy to do. So let's close these settings. And then these are the helpful chat box settings. So by default, it's going to automatically scroll to the bottom of the page here for you. So as you receive messages, so if I start dumping a bunch of messages in here, and let's just duplicate that. Boom, 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 boom. See how it goes all the way here, and it's scrolling to the top. This chat box, if you have this auto scroll selected, that scroll bar is automatically going to snap to the bottom of the page when new chat messages display. So that's something helpful for you. And then you can start the chat box enabled if you want. By default, I say no. And then enable on connect is something nice, because if you have this network manager selected here, it's going to say, oh, as soon as the network manager connects to the main server, I will enable this. And then there's debug settings, so you can see all the individual actions that are taking place with the chat box. But one thing that you need to do with chat box is set it up. So let's go ahead and go to Photon, the Photon main page, that is. Photon Pan, it's just that top one. I'm going to go ahead and sign in. Okay, so here we're signed in, and so here's a chat box that I have set up. And remember, you can go in here and create app and Photon chat, but I call it Invector chat, and I have my ID here. So let's go to manage, and remember, you can add or more people to connect. By default, the free version allows you to have 20 people, but here you can add authentication methods. Remember, that's the authentication type in the application, and then you can set your values here. So by default, there's no authentication, and then now here's something that's really nice. We can set up profanity filters. So let's set up a chat filter, and there's a couple of different options here. So you could set what type of filter that you want. So, and I'll explain a little bit about here of what that filter is. And then you could drop filter message. You can return the filtered message, and if it does, it's going to return like little number symbols or hash symbols, however you want to say that. And then there's also a community, like an enterprise edition, but honestly, for this one is just fine for me. But if you wanted to return specific types of filters, then you can do that. But let's go ahead and turn that filter on and click save. Let's come back down here and we see that our filter is now here. And of course you can add certain webhooks to call maybe Amazon Web Services if you wanted to call that. And then certain regions you want to allow. So let's click and we can, like it says, EU, Asia, or, we want to prevent Asia. So we only want the EU and US. And then here we have that region whitelist there. But that's pretty much it. Setting up the chat box is fairly easy. And then if you want to set up your own UI, just come over here to this chat box component is pretty much the only thing that you need. It should add the animator component and the audio source for you. But basically add that into your root of the UI object, and then pretty much populate the parts with your chat message, and you can design that to your needs.